start. Hello, my name's Charlie. I'm one of the conference organisers and I'll be chairing the session today. So as you can see, this is the session titled Uses of the Past. And first we've got Sarah Betts talking about debating the forgotten century, public histories of the 17th century in Britain. And then Andrii Kepsha on creating a new vision of the past, Russian cartoon versus historical sources. So presenters, we'll just ask you to speak into this microphone for the live streaming, and just to use the keyboard over there to manage your presentations. After the two presentations, after about sort of half an hour, we'll open up the floor to questions, and we'll have a roaming mic coming round so that live stream attendees can hear the questions. That's all from me. I'll pass on to Sarah to start the session.
Thank you. Okay. Before I begin, I should say that I think, well, on the programme, as was just announced, my original title said that I was going to be talking about Britain, and I don't really know why I said that in the first place. Because although that's kind of true, it's going to become fairly clear that I'm actually really only going to be talking about England, which I think is something not irrelevant to the questions at hand, so hopefully that'll be all right. I should also say that today's talk is less of a fully fledged argument and more a kind of rumination around questions of public history, not necessarily as a practice, but as general knowledge about history amongst the general public. And the perception of that knowledge by traditionally academically trained historians. And it was sort of inspired by an online roundtable discussion that I listened to last summer. So the Cromwell Museum in Huntington is housed in the building of the school, which was attended by Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century, who later became Parliamentarian General in the Civil Wars, and ultimately Lord Protector and ruler of the English Republic in the 1650s. And like a lot of heritage institutions, the museum responded to the pandemic by massively upping its online content and developed regular contributions to its YouTube channel, promoted via its other social media. The particular item that inspired today's talk was episode 26 of their Cromwellian Conversations series, and featured the museum's curator, Stuart Orme, in discussion with the historians Rebecca Warren, Paul Lay and Miranda Malins on, to quote Orme, the very knotty question of why the 17th century isn't better known. The episode from August last year is still available to view for free on the museum's YouTube channel. The idea that the 17th century is in some way forgotten is something commonly and repeatedly posited, bemoaned and puzzled over amongst historians of 17th century England. At the beginning of the Cromwellian Conversations discussion, Paul Lay, at the time the editor of History Today magazine, neatly outlined the twofold crux of that puzzle for the experts, arguing that in the 17th century there's an enormous amount of resonance for the present day. This, he argued, is because you're talking about the relationship between the constituent parts of Britain and Ireland, which is obviously important. You're talking about the relationship between Britain and Europe, which is plainly important. You're talking about Britain's role in the world, because here we're seeing the nascent British Empire emerging, and we know how resonant that is. We're talking about religious fundamentalism and religious differences, constitutional matters and the relationship between Parliament and the Crown. All these things resonate immensely. It is an immensely resonant period, and it remains a puzzle as to why it is neglected. But by whom is it neglected? And here Lay highlights the real puzzle, that he can't think of a period of British history, certainly, that has had such a sustained amount of scholarship that's touched every area of it, of the highest quality, and yet so little of that has really reached a wider public. This then is clearly a public history question. It's not a neglected area of study in the academy, but a question of what the general public know, or rather perhaps do not know, about the 17th century, and a little bit about what academic historians think they should know. And what evidence is there, then, that the period is forgotten? And the Cromwell Museum's panellists were fairly clear on the biggest manifestation of this neglect, the screen, both big and small, which Lay describes as so crucial for these kinds of things. in keeping with a wider recognition and in some cases exasperation in academia in recent decades that it is from popular culture in which film and television loom so large that the vast majority of people learn most of their history. Introducing the discussion, Stuart Orme remarked that there were not many documentaries or dramas on television, and not many films compared to the Tudors, the Second World War, the Georgian, Victorian and medieval periods, or even the Romans. And Lay then early on remarked that while there are a few documentary series starting to come up in recent years on the 17th century, these were mostly tucked away on BBC 4, whilst there was just that very week yet another high-profile documentary about Anne Boleyn. And how can there be anything left to say about Anne Boleyn? Throughout the discussion, Anne Boleyn, the Tudors more generally, and Henry VIII in particular, were repeatedly brought up as the contrasting example of a gluttonous public history diet, particularly in screen media. Is then, the panel postulated, the reason the 17th century gets such little screen time in comparison to the 16th, because the Stuart royal family are less sexy characters than their Tudor predecessors, lacking, as Rebecca Warren observed, high-profile divorces. In the closing essay of Susan Doran and Thomas Freeman's 2008 collection Tudors and Stuarts on Film, Ronald Hutton asked, why don't the Stuarts get filmed? Partly, he concluded, it was because the 17th century was too complicated for many formats, particularly the limited running time of a feature film, and the complexity of the social, religious and political turmoil of the century is certainly one of the key factors which others who have discussed the question, including the Cromwell Museum panel, have used to explain the reluctance or collective psychological block in modern society from engaging with the period. But in his essay, Hutton actually concludes that it is not accurate to say that the Stuarts don't appear on film. Totting up England's royal dynasty's respective appearances on screen, Hutton demonstrates that in fact the Stuarts come in third place, and that if you leave aside the artificial boost of the Plantagenet numbers by screenings of Shakespeare and walk-on parts in Robin Hood, then the Stuarts come in second only to the ever-dominant glamorous appeal of the Tudors. And so he suggests that it might be more appropriate to ask, why don't the Stuarts get filmed memorably? Certainly for academics, one reason seems to be that the occasions when they have been filmed more memorably, the treatments of the history are memorable because they are bad. Andrew Hopper has noted of cinematic depictions of history more generally, and of Civil War histories on screen in particular, that academic concerns for the quality of popular or public history have grown. Historians have begun to engage more with visual media as both a competitor and a collaborator in communicating the past to the public. And that consequently, although it has not always been viewed as such in the past, it is in fact, and it is increasingly viewed as, integral historians' business to influence how historical characters are presented to the wider public through active involvement in and public engagement with creative pop cultural productions. This, Hopper argues, will avoid the position where historians such as John Morrill find themselves relieved, even celebratory, at the commercial failure of a bad film depiction of the period as a good thing for the historiographically responsible communication of history, when of course the flip side is that such commercial failure renders the already neglected subject matter to be further shunned by commissioners and producers in future. But public engagement with history goes beyond film and television. Although not entirely removed from television culture, Paul Lay reminded the other panellists that the figure of Oliver Cromwell still holds some place in public discourse because, and I quote, we all know about the famous BBC poll where he came in very high in terms of the greatest Briton, whatever that means. This poll, conducted in 2002, sought to define the 100 greatest Britons in the eyes of the general public. The top 10 of these 100 were then each featured in a programme where they claimed to be a Great Britain was laid out by a celebrity champion, and then further public votes were cast to determine the final order of these 10. There were several still living figures selected in the 100, but all of the final 10 were already deceased. And Cromwell, the only figure from the Civil Wars to feature in the 100 at all, came in at number 10. And these were the top 10. So the only other representatives from the 17th century were Newton at number 6, Guy Fawkes, a rather interesting choice, who of course was executed right at the beginning of the century in 1606, who came in 30th place, and Sir Walter Raleigh, who was really more famous for his career in the reign of Elizabeth I in the 16th century and spent much of what remained of his life in the 17th century in prison and was ranked 93rd. This raises two key things to think about in terms of public memory of and knowledge about the 17th century. First is the importance of name and or significant moment recognition over long-term complex engagement with historical detail. and I'll come back to this in a moment, but second is the concept of the 17th century as conceived as a historical period. When considering the question of the century being forgotten, particularly from the angle of why the public should in fact be remembering and taught about it, academic historians are usually thinking only about particular aspects or portions of the period from 1600 to 1700. They stress the particular importance of the mid-century, the civil wars, the execution of Charles I and abolition of the monarchy, the interregnum under Cromwell's rule, the restoration of Charles II in 1660, and the Glorious Revolution, when James II was deposed in favour of William and Mary, and the Bill of Rights, constitutional monarchy, exclusive Anglicanism of the Crown, and two-party parliamentary system were established. Developments such as the beginning of the press, of the navy, of the empire, of empirical science are discussed, but usually in relation to the above key political events. Likewise, with environmental features of the period such as harvests, plague, or the Great Fire of London, little attention in these conversations is given to the final years of Elizabeth I, of Shakespeare, the union of the crowns, and the reign of James VI I. To the end of the century, often incorporated into the long 18th century, or to the final years of Stuart rule, including the Act of Settlement and the Act of Union, and stretching to the death of Queen Anne in 1714. So interestingly, and perhaps related to why Hutton's point about the Stuarts can go unnoticed, not a periodisation based on years of Stuart rule in England. As mentioned previously, these discussions are often specific to England, and there is a different story to be told of the resonances and public history of the period in Scotland, and particularly Ireland. Obviously, the 5th of November is remembered, but quite superficially, and usually is not mentioned in these discussions about the significance of the period, seeming to belong to an earlier, almost long 16th century world instead. But superficial or name recognition stereotyped approaches to history are central to what broader general public history looks like. The lack of public engagement with the 17th century has been highlighted several times as a topic aside from screen history in recent years, as various campaigns for dedicated museums and heritage sites related to the period, particularly to the civil wars, have been challenged by public apathy and consequent lack of funds. It seems when one compares the English Civil War battlefields, for example, with the great heritage national parks created around those of the American Civil War, or even with Bosworth, for example, in England, that the English Civil War period is perhaps still too complex to be grasped and appreciated by the public, or perhaps it is still too controversial to be of use in serving a narrative of national heritage. But superficial anecdote and stereotype does survive in public discourse. One need only look at media, traditional and social, through controversies and crises such as the coalition government's reforms of the history curriculum, often illustrated by both image and anecdote of the fundamental national historic moment of the Civil War, of the narrative of Puritans and Cavaliers in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, of the Brexit divisions where both sides claim the other to be the wrong but romantic, in an echo of the summary of public history of the Civil Wars in Seller and Yateman's hit book of nearly 100 years ago, 1066 and all that, of the images of Charles I conjured by the controversy over Boris Johnson's intention to prorogue Parliament, and of course, in the commentary of the last 2 weeks, over the historic associations of the new King Charles III's choice of regnal name. These public histories and understandings of the civil wars, superficial and lacking in detail though they might be, are a culmination of a longer thread of public knowledge, going back before the advent of film, but through an array of interrelated popular cultural media, right back to the 17th century itself. Although academic historians might deplore the lack of nuance at best, or outright anachronisms and falsehoods at worst in these pictures of a national history, examining the echoes, iterations and reiterations of superficial engagements with and understandings of the 17th century, considering what elements of that past, however insignificant or even incorrect they may be, have resonated across the centuries since, can help us to build a picture of public understandings of their past, of the way that public histories are created, learnt, remembered and rendered meaningful. The 17th century may not be remembered in the ways that professional specialist historians may want it to be. That is not necessarily the same thing as being forgotten by the public.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Sarah, and I'll pass over to Andrii now. Just skip slide across the presentation.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Let's start our presentation. As you can see, creating a vision vision of the past, Russian cartoons versus historical sources. I would like to speak about one of the most prominent and famous all over the post-Soviet and Eastern European areas, about three heroes, epic heroes, as you can see on this picture of 19th century painter Vasnetsov, a Russian Soviet painter. Three bohatyrs. We can see Ilya Muromets in the center, Dobrina to the left, and Alyosha or Oleshka Popovich to the right. Three main characters of the 19th-20th century that were created in the public sphere in 19th and 20th centuries. They were popular since 19th century in different spheres. For example, as you can see to the left, paintings by different painters, of course, in modern days, as you can see in the cartoons, three heroes, and of course in other public spheres, including sculpture and so on and so forth. So three main epic heroes. But what does it mean, this bohatyr, or this epic hero? We have precise information from historical sources, 13th century chronicle, which was Galician-Volhynian chronicle, which was created in the western part of Ukraine, or at that time south eastern part of the so-called Kievan Rus, or just Rus, modern-day western Ukraine. We have 1240. As you all know, Mongolian invasion, devastating all the modern-day Ukraine and northern eastern part of Kievan Rus, from Suzdal up to Lviv and to Hungary and Poland. And during this 1240 we have two, the so-called bogatyrs, Subotai Bagatur and Buruntai Bagatur, the so-called Genghis Khan's dogs of the war, the most famous and powerful political and military figures throughout the Mongolian history during the first half of 13th century. So basically this term bogatyr has its, we may say, Eastern origins or Turkish origins. So it has completely from another part of the world, we may say. The Mongols that appeared in our steppe before 1223, which was Dishti Kipchak, or the so-called the Kipchak steppe, but after 1223, when Mongolian forces just completely destroyed the alliance of all the Russian princes on Kalka River, Russian princes were destroyed, as you can see on this picture, the triumph of the Mongolian forces. And of course 1240, which was like this divided line between these two periods, pre-Mongolian and after-Mongolian, when Kiev was completely devastated, destroyed, and the western part of modern Ukraine as well. So what Genghis Khan started, Batu Khan continued with his bogatyrs. Then they disappeared throughout all the centuries, throughout Lithuanian period, Rzecz Pospolita or Polish period, and through Cossack periods. But in 19th century they appeared again, but in completely another sphere, in folklore and the so-called Belina, so Belina epic poems. We have one great example of Dobrina Nikic, one of these epic heroes, one of these bogatyrs. We have an exact, we may say, historical figure from 10th, 11th century. We may say from Rus, possibly from this Kiev region, who was a druzhnik, or the elite warrior, a nobleman, and we will see that he was also a political figure. During times of one of the greatest rulers of the Kievan Rus, Volodymyr the Great, or Volodymyr I, who baptized the Rus territories in 988, we have the first notion of Dobrina, 970, when his father of Vladimir's father, Svetoslav, he divided his country among his sons, 3 sons. But the youngest one, Volodymyr, who would be the Grand Prince of Kiev and the whole Rus, he was sent up to the north, to the Novgorod, where all the Rus started, where the Viking influences was still very powerful. And Dobrynya, well, basically he was his tutor, his trainer, his friend, and so on and so forth. Why? Well, basically because he was his uncle. Because Volodymyr was the younger son, and he could never be the Grand Prince of Kiev. So, together with his uncle, he went up to the north to Novgorod. The second notion, we may trace the Dobrynya throughout the history of Vladimir when he began his war with his all elder brothers, and basically he killed them, devastated the Polotsk together with Dobrynya, who was his great advisor, killed his elder brother Yaropolk, and well, basically he became a Grand Prince of Kiev. Later on, he sent Dobrynya again up to the north as a ruler of the northern part of Rus, the Viking, the Norman part of the Rus, because he became a ruler of the southern part, a Grand Prince of Kiev and the whole Rus. And in 985, together with his uncle again, they waged war against the Volga Bulgars. As you can see on these 2 pictures, that's a military expedition against these Bulgars and peace treaty between them. These images they are taken from the Radzivillian Chronicle from 15th century. Basically, that's the picture of this military expedition and this peace treaty between them. But 19th century, what we have here in 19th century, all over the Russian Empire, but basically around Suzdal, Vladimir, and Moscow, and Ukrainian territories. We have a new type of hero, a new folklore epic hero. They appeared in these Belinas or epic poems, but they are some kind of mix of Bogatyr and Kozak, even in modern day Russian territories. They are depicted as a classical hero. They are courage, they are fighting with the serpents, with the dragons, they are fighting for glory of their king, and so on and so forth. The difference between Ukrainian type of this hero and Russian, basically there is no difference. They are quite similar. In even just the basic difference, the main difference is just simply the language. But 20th and 21st century, we have a new type of this hero in Russian cartoons. Classic hero Bogatyr, he is fighting with the others. Who are these others? Basically, they are dragons. There's a symbol of something from the east. They are depicted as the Mongols, as the Tatars, or the Saracens, or the pagans. And there was a funny moment in that cartoon. I believe no one watched it, but I highly recommend it. There was a moment when this Bogatyr, he was crossing the border of the Rus, and right on the border there was a sign. And one direction is Rus, the opposite direction is enemies, just simply enemies. So everyone around Rus, they are enemies. Something interesting and similar to a modern day situation. But what about the ruler? As we know from historical sources, Volodymyr the Great was a ruler of that time, but in this cartoon he is depicted as a funny guy, as you can see on this photo, on this in this image. Volodymyr the Great, the Grand Prince of Kiev. So what do we have? What can we trace from this evolution of this hero from the Middle Ages up to modern days? Bogatyr was completely recreated as a Russian personage. Despite the fact that basically 10th, 11th century there was no Russia like a state, modern day state. He is a classical hero. He is brave, reliable, responsible, powerful, and so on and so forth. But the Crown Prince is some kind of the opposite personage of this situation. He's portrayed unintelligent, foolish, ridiculous, simple-minded, treacherous, unreliable, and so forth. What is more important, that ruse as a ruse is depicted completely in a different way. It is, as you can see on this image, that's a classical Moscow Kremlin of 16th, 17th century, so completely another epoch. And also there are a lot of interesting details about the political system, how they react, how the Grand Prince make decision, that is some kind of despot, which is a completely different thing from the Kievan Rus period. And to conclude about this Bohatyr, he's from a Rus Bohatyr, excuse me, to he is completely some kind of evolution to Russian Bohatyr, and at the same time the Grand Prince, everything which is connected with Kiev is something stupid, something like a foolish, and a hero which is connected with the Russia is something glorious. So that's just one example of these heroes. We have this Dobrynya. That's all. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrii. So we're now going to open up the floor to questions. Does anyone have any questions to start? I'll come over with the mic so that they can be heard to the live stream. Anyone want to start?
So my question is first of all, thank you both of you for interesting presentations. So my question is to Sarah. This morning we discussed that my interest in history started with wanting to write historical fiction. And when I go to writers' events, I am the only representative for the 17th century. So I'm very proud to be a representative of the least popular century. So my question to you is, have you seen any studies about the representation of the Stuarts in literature and novels? By any chance?
Yes.
And what do they say? There must be even less, I think.
So there's a new book.
I'll just pass you the mic. Hold on.
Oh, sorry.
So there was a new book that came out a couple of years ago, in 2020, by a lady called Farah Mendelssohn, who also has written some historical fiction. She wrote a book about the portrayal of the civil wars in English literature, well, English language literature, because some of the literature she talks about is American. And a little bit like the Ronald Hutton essay about the Stuarts actually being on film, but they're not very good or well-known films, there is actually a lot of literature, but nobody's really read it, nobody really knows it, and she's got some ideas about why that is, about why it sort of has a bit of a high point at various points. It sort of tails off a bit in the second half of the 20th century, but is having a bit of a renaissance now, but mostly around sort of military fiction, mostly. There's a bit of other stuff as well. She looked at, I think, 186 novels from Daniel Defoe's 1720 Memoirs of a Cavalier to actually the lady who was in the Cromwell conversation that I was talking about, Miranda Malins. So she did her PhD about the Cromwellian court in the 1650s, and she decided instead of, and partly because of this idea that it's something that people don't really know about, she decided that instead of turning her PhD into a monograph, she has started writing fiction about Cromwell's daughters. So she wrote a book called The Puritan Princess, which is about her youngest daughter, his youngest daughter, Frances, and then either earlier this year or the end of last year, her second book came out, which is actually about the oldest daughter, Bridget. So there is stuff about of varying quality and at various times. across the period. I don't really know why a lot of it's not better known. Some of it is bad, but some of it is quite good. Some of it's written by quite well-known people, like Daphne du Maurier, and I mean, the Rosemary Sutcliffe one, Simon, is quite well-known, but really compared to a lot of her other stuff, not particularly. Yeah, I don't know why people don't like it. There is a bit of an idea that all fiction about the Civil War must be royalist, and people don't really sympathise with the royalists in the same way, that nobody wants to like the parliamentarians. This actually isn't particularly true, and that's one of the main things in Farah Mendelssohn's book, is that she's like, actually, if you look at it on a really superficial level, it's pro-royalist, but a lot of the stuff is quite critical of the king, of the monarchy. A lot of it's a lot more radical than it might on the surface appear. But it is still something that people worry about. To think of a big name, so Bernard Cornwell gets this question a lot. Everyone's like, we love all your historical fiction, you love military fiction, are you ever going to write something about the English Civil War? And for a long time now, his answer has been no, because the wrong people won. And the Cavaliers are fun, but they're wrong and they lose, and no one wants to read a book about losers. But actually the really interesting thing is that about 30, 40 years ago, he co-wrote a Civil War novel with his wife, and it was meant to be the beginning, I think, of like a trilogy, and they just gave up after the first one. But it wasn't very good. No one's ever really heard of it. And it clearly put him off it for life, to the point that he doesn't really mention it anymore. So I don't know why. But Farah Mendelssohn's book is the main one to read. There's a bit of other stuff about some of the main authors and stuff like that out there. But really, if you're looking for a main book, then yeah.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Does anyone have any other questions? Laura?
Thank you very much for both of your presentations. This question is kind of for both of you, and more generally about the uses of the past. Do you think there's something to do with how you both talk about conflict and warfare? Do you think the uses of the past are more complicated when it comes to conflict because of the narrative between winners and losers, or is it because there is it's just highly political, or is it just too convoluted and confusing for people to address and talk about? I hope that makes sense.
So one of the problems, and again one of the reasons why I think people get put off by the 17th century and the Civil Wars in particular, is because it's quite difficult to know who won. So there's obviously like individual battles where it's clear, although actually the first big battle they have, it's not clear who won, and everyone claims they won, and everyone sort of lost. Obviously the parliamentarians do win initially, and then the king comes back, and then the Glorious Revolution happens, but we still have a monarchy. So it's all a bit messy, and it's very messy in terms of who wants to remember what, and who wants to remember what when, and who wants to forget what. And it makes it very convoluted, and you don't quite know who the winners and losers are. And I've done a bit of work on war memorials and like war memorials of the Civil War, and there aren't really any specific early war memorials on like battlefields and things in the way that you might expect, and in the way that you then see in the American Civil War, for a variety of reasons. But it does mean that when they start putting war memorials on Civil War sites in the 20th century mainly, they're put on as historical markers. It's about recognising that history happened there, and it's less, although actually there's sort of often interested parties who put things up, so like a lot of the early monuments are by sort of relatives or genealogical associations, or the Cromwell Association, which is very involved in promoting history of the Civil War. Although it's got that sort of angle, it's more about commemorating the fact that something historical happened there, and they want to commemorate both sides, and they make quite a big deal. And especially as you get more and more modern, it becomes much more about commemorating the fact that a war happened, honouring the dead of both sides, and being grateful for the fact that peace is now here, rather than about who was on what side then. So yeah.
My answer will be a little bit like more wide, if you don't mind. Talking about the history of Russia and Ukraine, it's not just about a warfare, conflict, or something like that. When you're talking about the Russian history, it's always very hard, tough, and complicated because too many things like false information, and especially official false information. This information during 18th, 19th century when just was rewritten the past, all the chronicles, all the things, all the archives and so on and so forth. And when you're talking about the Middle Ages especially, well, I always have the same question. Rus and Russia, why? How did this evolve to that? How Moscow became a Russian empire, the change of the name, for example. So we have the same example with these heroes, and it's always about the false information, and you have to struggle with it because they will win us throughout the centuries, and they wrote their own history, and especially this very well. I have always compared the situation with Rus and Russia is the same as we may say, for example, a Roman Empire and modern day Romania. So that's completely different things. You have Rome and you have modern Romania. Different nations, different cultures, somewhere on the border identities and so on. The same we have with Moscow. So we have the epicenter, the cave land, and the Novgorod, we may say, and we have Moscow, which conquered all the territories up to the north, Pskov, Tver, Smolensk, Novgorod Republic. They just destroyed local cultures and rewrite their history during 15th, 16th century, and especially during the rule of Peter I and Catherine II. So they create a new vision of the past, a completely new vision, and that the idea of the Third Rome, which was presented by the monk, I suppose, field of faith, that there were two Romes fell, a third still stands. So we are talking about the Rome like Rome, Constantinople, 1453, and now we have Moscow, the third Rome, and there will never be a fourth. So the idea of a global control, of idea of this Byzantine emperors, Roman emperors, but it's please excuse me, but it's all fake. Whether they are patriarchs, whether they are church which was created by them own, just because they wanted to do that. So it's about now we have these, I suppose, last 10 years when Ukrainians started to talk about their past from their perspective, because throughout the centuries, 200 years, there was just one version. So that's why it's important, because a lot of things was stolen. Sorry for this long speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Hello, thank you both for giving me some interesting things to think about. I've got a question, again, addressed to both of you. What was coming out for me while you were both speaking is that you've got characters from the past that may or may not suddenly become resonant because of something that's happening right now, or values that are important to us right now. I'm wondering if either of you have seen examples of your neglected characters or your consistent characters being subverted to represent counterculture values that are happening right now, if that makes sense.
So, a little bit. Not as much right now, because a lot of the stuff right now, in terms of sudden attention on the 17th century, as I say, is like, is King Charles III really sure he wants to be King Charles III? Does he want to be the third person on that list? So, in that sense, I suppose not so much reviving counterculture figures, but maybe a sort of resistant countercultural interpretation of more establishment figures. But there has been other times where figures have enjoyed, from the 17th century, have enjoyed resurgences because they seem to have a particular resonance at a particular political moment. So the most famous screen depiction of the 17th century is a film called Cromwell from 1970, which very much pitches Cromwell as, you know, the father of democracy, which is a reputation that he's had for a very long time, going back into the 19th century. But 19th century's idea of what the father of democracy is about is not the same as what it was by 1970. And the Royalists and the Charleses and things have been, well, were for a long time pushed aside in the historiography with this idea that actually we don't want to be learning about kings and queens. And the 17th century is this brilliant time where we can learn about ordinary people. And so the parliamentarians became these sort of big radical, originally Marxist heroes, but then other groups sort of adopted them. And then they started to look and think, actually, there are some people who are a bit more radical than Cromwell who maybe speak better to us, like the Levellers in particular, or the Diggers, or occasionally the Ranters, but not very often the Ranters. Yeah, so there's times where these things become more current. I think the Greatest Britain poll is quite an interesting example, and if you ever get a chance to have a look at it, it's like a gold mine for public history, because there are people who are still alive on the list, and one of the things that people thought about when they were nominating, voting for these people, was this idea that these people were historically significant. And some of the people who were on the list in 2002, but probably wouldn't be on the list now. And that's particularly the case for the more current figures. So, I mean, I feel like somebody like Boy George probably wouldn't make the list now, but did in 2002. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mum, she made it. Both of the Queen Elizabeth. The poll got quite a lot of bashing because of the sorts of people who were on it. I mean, there's no way now, I don't think, that Princess Diana would make it to spot number 3 of the greatest Britons of all time, after like Churchill and Brunel, because it's a disconnect. But at the time, obviously, the Diana stuff was still very hot. But it got into a lot of trouble. There were no black people on the list. They then had to do another 100 Greatest Black Britons, because it was quite controversial that there were no black people on the list. There were only 13 women on the list, and they were kind of the people you'd expect: Princess Diana, the Queen Mum, Boudica, Victoria, Jane Austen, and Mary Stopes, I think. I can't think who else was there, but it's not very. Maybe Florence Nightingale might have made it, but it's not a big list. And then there's lots of people who are big in, like, again, like maybe David Beckham would still make it, but he was like a big favourite in 2002, but not so much now. And there's pop stars and sports stars and people like that. So yeah, so I think it's interesting to see how these things sort of mill around.
I would like to agree firstly, because in our region, in Ukraine and post-Soviet or eastern part of Europe, there are still a lot of these hard questions, and this completely new field to discover a lot of questions, especially from this Soviet period. There are still a lot of people who the idea of this public, of this public conference was so attractive for me because I would like to share just one question. I was talking with my friend of mine. His grandfather, he was a soldier in Red Army. We were talking about different things like terror, about the famine, about the repression, Stalins, and all the things. But when we were talking about the Second World War, he was like, no, they were heroes. Why? Because my grandfather was there. Full stop. No discussion. And there are a lot of these topics which we still don't want to talk about, because there are a lot of people who are connected to these events. I don't know, Chernobyl, 1970s, 80s, all the repressions, a lot of poets who were fighting against the Soviet regime, and they want to talk, but they, for example, do not have access to the archives because, and that's just 20th century. A friend of mine, a great colleague, he's working in a museum. He was working with the documents. Well, to be honest, illegally. I hope he won't see this video, because he was working with the documents. He had an access to the green documents, but there was also a worker from that archive. He just went out, and my friend saw another document, a red one, full of blood, from 1920s, and there was a list of victims who were just killed. And we still do not have an access to these documents. And because there are a lot of people who are connected to these documents, they're still alive. Even, I don't know, maybe it's a kind of our first two presidents who were part of Soviet regime. And of course, they do not want to talk and to pick up all these questions to discuss and so on and so forth. So in our country, in Ukraine, people sometimes are not ready to talk. Are not ready to discuss simple questions about the past of their grandmothers, grandfathers, and that's maybe why I pick up the events from far away past, from medieval history, because whoever you ask, what is Rus? Oh, Rus, that's Russia. Rus, Russia. That's Ukraine. What's Ukraine from 19th century, maybe 12th century. So there are a lot of stereotypes, there are a lot of false information, disinformation, and there are a lot of people who still are fighting against this truth. In Russia, when I say in Ukraine, like current situation, current events, they changed us a lot. And since 2014, I suppose, since revolution and until now. So I suppose I would like to use all this knowledge that we are discussing here, sharing with each other, just to provide it in my country, to share with my colleagues, and just because we need it so much. That's would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got about sort of maybe 5 or 6 minutes left. Does anyone have a concluding question?
I'm from the White Hairs, right? So I did my O-levels in Britain, raised in Britain, early 60s. Okay, so I'm contemporary with the Blackadder people. Okay, so I think they and I must have read the same book. Okay, so what do you get? You get in Blackadder, you get exactly what we had. We were supposed to be, studying for our levels, the Tudors and Stuarts, right? We studied the Tudors, the Tudors, the Tudors, the Tudors. Whoops, ran out of time, vipped to the Stuarts. So that's what happened in the 60s, okay? You didn't get the Tudors and the Stuarts, you got mostly the Tudors, okay? I'm also a musician, so actually music did continue, although there was a lot of lament as soon as we got into the 17th century that music had died, okay, the Silver Swan, but it didn't happen. And if you study the history of music, music was going on in the 17th century, and if I hum a tune from there, you'll recognize it. I mean, it's still in the repertoire. So there are some things. And then the other thing is women. women were actually making steady progress, okay? There was nothing to do with this guy's, fighting and stuff like that. So I just mentioned from, other points of view, and I think it will make a difference that Charles has decided to be Charles III. I think it will be. I think there will be a lot of interest in discussing what happened to Charles I and Charles II, and is Charles III, interested in reducing the monarchy, in which case he's picked a good name.
Wonderful. Any other questions? There you go.
Thank you both for your presentations. My question is specifically for Sarah, if that's okay. You talked a lot about how we haven't seen much representation of the Stuarts on screen, and I think, as you said, a lot of people's perceptions about a specific era come from what they've seen on television or on film, in fiction or on documentaries. But you also talked about how people sort of have an underlying sort of perception of what a person or a time might be like. So people clearly had enough of a vague idea of what Cromwell is like to vote him as 10th greatest Briton. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you think that sort of vague, distant understanding that people have comes from. If it doesn't come from film or television, does it come from the little they might have learned at school? Or is it just sort of where does this sort of general knowledge, vague knowledge come from, I guess?
Okay, so this is quite a long, complicated question, but the short answer is they obviously do start promoting characters and ideas of what's happening actually during the Civil Wars. So there is this explosion of print media. There's the first things that can really be recognised as newspapers, certainly as daily news. There's newspapers that are published sometimes daily, sometimes every couple of days, sometimes weekly, often on a regular day, so that people can sort of catch up with the news. So, and both sides are printing. So the main printing presses are in London, and the parliamentarians take London basically at the beginning of the war. They're already there because the king's left. But the king sets up presses. There's one at York, there's one at Oxford, there's one in various other places where the royalists congregate. So there are sort of ideas of prominent figures, prominent ideas of both sides going around. And then in the 1650s and 1660s, a lot of this actually continues, and there is this perception, as was just mentioned, that sort of culture just kind of died during the 1650s, and there was no music, and there's no theatre, and there's no drama or fun or any of that kind of thing. But actually there's a lot of satire still going on. There's a lot of, like the theatres are closed, but there's still drama circulating. There's still music going on. There's still oral relation of news, gossip, and sort of anecdotes. And these things then continue to be repeated through the 18th century, through the 19th century. They make it into the first sort of beginnings of like popular history texts. And in the 18th and 19th century, there's much more of a bleed between what now we would call more popular history texts and scholarship and historical scholarship, and particularly in terms of things like life writing and biographies and stuff like that. And it is something that is considered a central part of education, and it's considered that for a long time, probably right up until the middle of the 20th century. And one of the reasons why it then tails off and doesn't really make it into a lot of very prominent popular culture in the second half of the 20th century, and why people think it is something they don't really know about, is because it drops out of the curriculum for a long time. I mean, you said you were at school in the 60s. I was at school in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and I never did the Civil War at school. I think we did it for a bit in year 8. We did the Tudors for the whole year, and then we did 1 week on the Civil War and 1 week on the French Revolution right at the end. And then we went into GCSEs and we just did First World War, Russian Revolution, Second World War, Nazis. And then at A-level, there were schools, there was an exam board that offered a module on Cromwell, I think, for A-level, but my school didn't do that option. So again, I mostly did 20th century history, not really very much British history. And, you know, I never did it. I never got the right options at uni at the time. We didn't have a compulsory module that covered that. There were modules on offer. I didn't do any of those. So I never really properly studied the Civil War. I'd read some bits and pieces about it, but I never really properly studied the Civil War until I did my undergraduate dissertation on the court of Charles I. And actually one of the reasons why I started doing my PhD was because I wondered what happened, because it was something that was just part of culture for such a long time, and then it just vanished. But there's still echoes of it, and there's still things that people recognise from it. So like the 1066 and all that book, which is now ancient, but that itself became this big cultural phenomenon. And there's this very famous section in it that says, well, the memorable civil wars between the Cavaliers, wrong but romantic, and the Roundheads, right but repulsive. And that's still something that people talk about today, even if they don't know anything about the civil wars, even if they've never read 1066 and all that. And it is, I discovered at a conference in France where I had to spend ages explaining the joke, that it is an Anglophone thing, obviously, because it's all to do with, because they spell romantic with a W. So it's clearly like an Anglophone sort of sense of humour. It's big in Britain, it's big in Australia, it's big in American culture. I went to a conference in France with loads of French people and they had no idea what I was talking about, and I had to spend ages being like, no, I didn't mean to spell romance with a W. But you know, it's something that still has some resonance through something that isn't actually originally connected to the Civil War and is quite superficial. And I think it does sort of be through culture. I mean, you talked about Blackadder, and Tony Robinson in particular, but I think a few of them have talked about how they'd have liked to have done a Civil War Blackadder. They didn't think they could because either the issues were too controversial or people wouldn't understand it enough to be able to get the jokes. But they do a comic relief special on the Cavalier years. And interestingly, they cast Stephen Fry as Charles I, where he basically does an impression of the then Prince of Wales dressed up as Charles I, which is an interesting prophetic moment for now, I think. But yeah, so I think there's sort of bits hanging around in culture, even if people don't quite know what they mean. And everyone kind of recognises the idea that, you know, Cavaliers are the sort of big floppy hats and big boots, and the Puritan, the boring. And then I should also say, Horrible Histories, and particularly the TV programme of Horrible Histories, is the thing that has continued that, and continued that tradition, and taken those anecdotes and those stereotypes and used them to talk about history to a new audience. So, yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I was hoping to hear your contribution to that question, but can we have a big round of applause for Sarah and Andrew? Fab, so thanks very much for coming. We've now got an hour's break for lunch before the next series of presentations. Thank you very much.